Well, there's a problem, and the problem, as he suggested at the beginning, is Stephen Hawking, right? And he says in Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, he develops a no boundary model of the beginning of the universe. And he uses imaginary time to avoid an absolute beginning while still retaining a finite past. So no absolute beginning, but a finite past, and to depict the initial segment of space-time as rounding off, very much like, for instance, the South Pole being the beginning of the Earth, right? So it's a kind of a rounding kind of thing. And he says, just as you cannot ask what is south of the South Pole, you can't ask what became before the rounding off section of the initial segment of space-time. And so there's no need then, according to Hawking's model here, for a beginning, and yet the past is still finite. So he gets both and with his model, right? A finite past, but no beginning, which is kind of interesting.
So Christians can't invoke God because it's an invisible imaginary friend, but scientists can use imaginary time and just be A-okay with it. So I guess that's where we're at for our levels there.
Yeah, it doesn't sound real fair, but hey,
Yeah. So it kind of at the beginning, instead of like a cone shape out, it's this round aspect to it, and this constant exploding, imploding model comes into effect. Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five kind of takes a little bit of that story element for his story in that, if you've read that. So this is something that has been developed, obviously, when Hawkins was alive, and other people have attempted to either use it or respond to it. And so we'll get into that just a little bit here. Well, philosophers, especially philosophers of science, have responded to Hawkins in two different ways. Well, first, the philosophical support for the cosmological argument's first premise, the universe had a beginning, is stronger than the support for Hawking's model. So one should still believe in a beginning, right? So just because he doesn't want this, development within his model, but still understands that, well, in order to get to here, wherever we're at here, we need to be able to not have an actual infinite, because an actual infinite isn't possible, and especially one in regard to time and space, then the explanatory power there is less so than just, well, the universe has a beginning. The Occam's razor tends to shrink back a little bit when you invoke Hawking to scientists. But if you just say, well, doesn't that just mean the universe has a beginning? Isn't that a more simple, less complex answer? Well, then you get all the hand waving and explanations.
All right, so that's his first issue with how philosophers of science have responded to Hawking's. The second response, because Hawking's model employs, as you mentioned earlier, imaginary time, the model should be understood, he says, in an anti-realist, or we might say an instrumentalist way, as, basically a useful fiction. Right? In other words, he's not claiming this is the way reality actually is. This is just a good way to explain it. It's a good story that helps us to explain it. But, who knows what reality is like? So it's an anti-realist or, an instrumental approach to scientific theory. It's a useful fiction in order to help us to explain, rather than a realist way as an actual depiction of the real world, right? So some of you may recall, or earlier in the book, he makes this distinction between anti-realist and realist theories of science, or perhaps better, anti-realist and realist perspectives on theories of science. Right? The realist says that scientific theories gives us truth, or at least approximate truth, and that the entities that they posit are real existing entities that actually do exist. That's what the realist says, or that's what the models purport to do. The anti-realist, or the instrumentalist, says, no, theories don't really give us any truth. They just give us useful stories, useful fictions in order to help us to explain our observations. We don't know whether they're true, and whether things that they posit, the entities that posit, are real. And so that's the anti-realist position. So these are philosophical positions about the nature of scientific theory. And so he's saying here that Hawkins is employing, with this imaginary time in his model, an anti-realist position. In fact, he says that Hawkins had acknowledged that this was his view, anti-realism, not a realistic depiction of reality. but rather a theory that merely has instrumental value. So Hawking didn't shy away from that. He, in fact, admitted that's what he was doing. But notice what he does here, J.P. Moreland. He says Hawking's admission that his model is nothing but a useful fiction must have come from his science? No, from his reading of philosophy of science in order for him to explicitly call himself an anti-realist. That's where that idea comes from.
Yeah.
Thus, it was the discipline of philosophy, he points out, that both placed Hawking's model in the classification which it belongs, a useful fiction, anti-realist position, and continued to show that his model did nothing whatsoever to undermine beliefs in the universe's beginning. And so Hawking's, for all his dismissing of philosophy, has to use philosophy in developing and explaining his model. Go figure, right?
Right. Yeah. Yep. And again, the book by Lee Strobel, The Case for the Creator, covers this explanation as well. From I think Craig does the same thing there as well. But I know it's in that book.